This lupulin adds bitterness to the beer, but also adds a lot of aroma. The term hangover could mean that you had too many drinks after the hanging was over. When brewers came from Europe, they brought with them the yeast that they're used to.
Hello and welcome again to Beertastic, the series. I'm Konrad Seidel, and my travel plans for this episode will take us to some of the most historic brewing towns in Europe, like Pilsen, Prague, Munich, Goslar or Ghent. We'll start in the hop fields of Bohemia to explore the so-called soul of beer. While malt is considered the body of beer, hops are quite a different ingredient. Only a few grams of them per hectoliter add all the bitterness and a good part of the aroma to a brew. Some people believe that bitterness can be quite challenging to the palate, and linguists argue that bitter has some negative connotations like in bitter disappointment or sadness. Ales in early times in England were considerably sweeter than those we know today, and Henry VIII supposedly called hops a wicked weed. But brewers have learned a lot about the right use of hops since his days as King of England. They have found the right balance between malty sweetness and hoppy bitterness. Hop growers, on the other hand, have bred new varieties of hops that add fruitiness and spiciness to the beers. And here's a little fun fact. Scientists have found out that bitterness increases your appetite. So if you're developing a beer belly, it's not the beer to blame, but rather the snacks you enjoy with it. That results in a little extra weight.
Saaz hops were a product for the world trade even when the world was much smaller than it is today. Brewers from all over Europe wanted to brew with Bohemian hops that were much more expensive but also twice as good as the hops that were locally grown. And that made Saaz, the city of Sátec, much richer than other towns in the region. So we can see some nice castles, we can see also a nice town center here in Saaz. We're here in the hop fields around Saaz, and this is what a hop field would look like by the beginning of June. The plants are out at a height of about 3-4 meters, and they will grow up to 7 meters high by the end of July. And by the end of August, they will be ready to harvest. So it's a very quickly growing plant, and what we're looking for is the aroma in the female flowers. And these aroma hops are the ones that give the typical aroma to a Pilsner style beer. The Saaz hops are more or less the characteristic of the Pilsner beer. What we see here is a female hop plant, and there's about 3 vines that wind up on a wire, and they grow and grow and grow for half a year. Saaz hops tend to be very low in bitterness, which means alpha acids, but very high and rich in aroma. So rare were these hops that you could not export the rhizome from which the plant grows in the Middle Ages. Actually, you would be punished if you exported some rhizome to other countries, so they built a monopoly for Saaz hops by just having these plants on these fields here. At hop harvest, this is what we're looking for. These whole vines are harvested, but actually you only want to pluck these hop flowers. It's the female hop flowers. And these female hop flowers, they contain a substance called lupulin. This lupulin adds bitterness to the beer, but also adds a lot of aroma. In Britain, there's a saying, turkeys, hops, heresy, and beer came into England all in one year. The year they're talking about is the year 1524. That was the year when turkey, a bird that lives in America, was first brought to England. And the very same year, the writings of Martin Luther were translated into English. So heresy came into England. But what about the hops and the beer? Well, in the years before 1524, most English ales were unhopped ales. So they distinguished between ales and beer, which was the hopped version of it. What did they use before they used hop? Well, they had plants, they had herbs, and had one special plant which grows in England and Ireland. It's heather. It's a flower that gives not much bitterness, but a distinctive taste to the beer. Also, if you think of the old beers, the old ales, well, some of them will have contained this beautiful little flower.
Hop picking used to be hard work in the old days. Whole families would gather in the hop field to harvest those small cones from the vine by hand. Today, machines do the job in a fraction of the time. They're so easy to handle that even I could learn to do some hop picking myself within a few minutes. Or maybe it was because I couldn't wait to sample the beers from that new harvest.
Hops are a costly ingredient, and in the last decades, some brewers tried to reduce expenses by ever lowering the bitterness of their brews. They claimed that many consumers, especially women, did not like the bitter taste anyway. But they were proven wrong. The demand for hops and hop bitterness is rising continuously. In recent years, many craft brewers competed in adding as many hops and as much bitterness as possible to their brews. The bitterness itself is measured in the amount of alpha acids, or international bitterness units. And in some of these beers, it's unbelievably high. Some beers contain 120 bitterness units,
more than 6 times as much as in an international lager. This extreme bitterness may work in India Pale Ales, but it does not work in Pilsner beers. Pilsners should only have a crisp bitterness and a noble hop aroma, like the one found in Saaz hops. While Pilsners are brewed in most countries around the globe, there's one town in Bohemia that can claim to be the birthplace of that particular style. That was the reason I took a small detour from Saaz to Pilsen, a majestic city with an impressive beer history.
Like in many other medieval towns, the burghers of Pilsen, those rich people who owned a building made of stone inside the city walls, enjoyed brewing privileges. These privileges more or less meant you could brew beer in your house and you could sell it inside the city and about a mile around the city. No one else was allowed to do that. So these privileges made burghers, the patricians, very rich. They had their brewing privileges, but their beer quality sort of decreased after several years. In the early 19th century, beer from Pilsen was considered not to be very good, and in 1838 it was decided that they would stop brewing in these small house breweries altogether and build a state-of-the-art brewery. Well, this state-of-the-art brewery made Pilsner beer world famous. In 1842, the burghers of Pilsen had constructed the Bürgerliches Brauhaus Pilsen, that brewery that we see right behind me. And they commissioned a brewmaster from Bavaria, Josef Groll, and he was commissioned to brew a dark beer, Bavarian-style beer, which was dark at the time. But he knew better. He brewed the first modern Pilsner-style beer. When Josef Groll came to Pilsen in 1842, he found one of the most modern breweries on earth, and that was the modern brew kettle. It was a square brew kettle, quite different from what we are using today. But he had the right ingredients. He had the soft water from Pilsen, he had the Saaz hops, and he had the palest malt that could be found in Europe at the time. Combined with a bottom fermenting yeast, this resulted in the beer that we now know as Pilsner beer. One key ingredient in modern beers, in all bottom fermenting beers, is the bottom fermenting yeast. Josef Groll brought some bottom fermenting yeast from Bavaria, and it's actually the same yeast strain that has later been isolated and kept in the brewery ever since and is used in production till today. Lager beer, and all Pilsens are lager beers, beers that are matured for a long time. Actually, they were matured in old wooden barrels, and they still do it just to demonstrate how beer was made in the old days. In fact, you wanted to have clear beer, and lagering means you store the beer till it gets clear. Well, this beer that we're here getting at the so-called pipa, well, it's very hazy. It's still hazy. You were waiting till the beer would be clear because the yeast would settle at the bottom, and then you had a more or less clear beer. Nowadays you do filtration, but that was like the beer was looking like in the days of Josef Groll. Cheers to him. There's also some yeastiness to the aroma. It's a very full-bodied beer, and it's kind of different to the Pilsner beers, the filtered Pilsner beers that you actually know when you buy Pilsner beer. Large-scale brewing made a real difference. Before the mid-19th century, there were many brewing towns with many small breweries. Each and every town had their different beers, but even in the small breweries, the beers were different. And even in the same brewery, you would find that the beer could be sweet in 1 week, bitter the next week, and maybe sour in the third week. What industrial scale brewing meant was having constant product. And Pilsen was one of the towns that made a standard. It set the standard for a relatively pale lager. And these beers, of course, were copied because many brewers said, we want to have a standard quality. So brewers in Austria, in Germany, even in Scotland decided they wanted to brew their own Pilsner beer. Different versions for different countries. So not every beer that was called Pilsner had a lot to do with what we get here in Pilsen. Many of these beers were just pale lagers. But on the other hand, the Pilsner name spread through the world. And now we have very different styles of Pilsner beer. There's German-style Pilsners, there's Bohemian-style Pilsners, there's international-style Pilsners, all different. And still, there's one thing that they have in common. They're brewed with bottom fermenting yeast, they're pale in color, and they're all beers that are very easy drinking. Lager beer brewing meant you had a standardized product. The use of bottom fermenting yeast enabled brewer to brew a beer that would taste exactly the same from batch to batch. And when you had such an industrial product, you wanted to export it. Of course, you could only do that on a small scale at a time when there were no railway lines. First beers from Pilsen to Prague went on horse-drawn carriages. But then later on in the 1860s, railway lines were built. And so Pilsner beer made a huge success by being transported to all corners of the earth. And it was a success everywhere. First city that was reached was Prague. And of course there was a railway line from Pilsen to Prague and further on to Vienna. At that time there was one train loaded with Pilsner beer that went from Pilsen to Vienna each and every day. Bohemian beer tradition dates back to the Middle Ages. And Prague was right at the center of the development. Kings and emperors resided here, and they all seemed to have enjoyed the beers of this town. Prague was granted brewing privileges at the commencement of the 14th century. These were similar to those that the burghers of Pilsen enjoyed. In Prague and its banlieues, French for a generously measured mile surrounding the city, the patricians enjoyed a monopoly on the sale of beer. Brewing was a source of wealth, at least until 1618 when the devastating 30 Years' War broke out. The beers of the time were radically different from what we find now when we wander the streets of Prague. It was dark beers brewed from barley and white beers brewed from wheat. While almost all Bohemian beers today are pale bottom fermented lagers, we can be almost sure that top fermenting ale brewing was practiced in those early days of Bohemian beer culture. Prague. Prague, the Golden City. The Golden City had been waiting for golden beer for a long time. Many people believe that Prague has the most vibrant cultural heritage of all Central European cities. The Prague Castle, the Radzin, is one of the largest castles in Europe. The old town,
is one of the best preserved city centers. And there's even a Jewish quarter with a handful of ancient synagogues and museums. No wonder that tourists from all around the world flood the city throughout the year. Some of them come for the music of Bedřich Smetana, others for the literature written by Franz Kafka. There are hard-to-believe stories that a Jewish magician named Judah Löw created a golem, a man-like living figure made out of clay that still roams the city at night. Magicians and alchemists were summoned to the castle to produce gold for the emperor. As far as we know, they didn't succeed. But a quick look at the rooftops and facades in Prague's old town demonstrates just how vital gold was for those who owned these buildings. For many other visitors, and me alike, the essential golden feature of the Golden City is the golden beer in the pubs and taverns.
To get an idea of what life was like in Prague in former centuries, it's a good idea to take a stroll all the way down from the Hradčín, the old imperial castle, on the King's Way to the old market square. And if you have a look into some of the smaller lanes, you really get this Prague feeling of the golden era. And in fact, many tourists do this today and will do the same now. Just off the old market square, we found a tavern called Ukata. It's an ancient tavern, and Ukata means the hangman. Hangings, executions, took place on that old market square. And afterwards, people would go and have a drink or two because they had watched the cruel procedure. And if they had too many drinks, what they had is a hangover. The term hangover could mean that you had too many drinks after the hanging was over. Well, linguists could dispute that, but what's true here is that this old market square always had a lot to do with good beer. What's definitely true about this old market square, this is a place where people have always been drinking beer. Of course, they've been doing business here. For merchants traveling the unsafe roads in Europe, coming to one of the richest towns in Europe, this place must have looked like paradise. This is why this old Tying church has two spires. One is called Adam, the other one is called Eve. Because you were in paradise when you could do business here. But before you could do business, you had to pay tax. You even had to pay tax for the beer you brought in. And so you had to go to Ungeld. Just behind the Tying church, you find the Ungeld court. Ungeld is an old German term for tax. It was initially just meant to mean beer tax. Later on, it was also a tax on wine and then on many goods that were imported into Prague. When merchants came into Prague, they brought their goods here to Ungeld and then they paid tax. And while these goods were sort of checked by the customs officer, maybe they had a beer here, and there were famous beers here in Prague. One was a wheat beer, the other one was a red beer. Heinrich Knaust, who was one of the first authors on beer, published a book in 1614, and he mentions these two beer styles. Unfortunately, most recipes got lost during the industrial period, and pale lagers took over. But still, we find some old-style beers here in Prague. We're now going to one of the oldest breweries in the Czech Republic and have a look at the dark Prager Dunkles beer and compare this to the Pilsner beer. And we'll see that the Prager Dunkles is even sweeter when you compare to Pilsner. Let's have a try. Here in this historic brew house, we can sample a glass of Prager Dunkles, the dark beer from Prague, which was popular till the mid-19th century. People were drinking from beer steins. They didn't see if the beer was dark or not. But once that glassware was available, cheap industrially produced glassware, that meant that people saw that the beer was dark and the other beer that came from Pilsen was much lighter in color. We all have our prejudices. I mean, we have prejudices not only regarding beer, but if beer is concerned, then you would say, well, a beer that's lighter in color, that's probably also lighter in alcohol, lighter in calories. Even if it's not true, people were tending to drink beer that has a pale color, and some stayed faithful to the old Prague Dunkles style. It tastes good from the glass and it tastes good from the beer mug. We can see that tourists and Prague residents alike love these old-style beers. Dark Prague lager has still lots of fans. It has this caramelly touch. It has this licorice-like aroma. Lots of body, and it's really good drinking beer. In fact, I could drink that all day. By the end of the 19th century, most larger breweries in continental Europe had installed maltings and brew houses that were capable of producing pale lagers, more or less copying what Josef Groll had brewed in Pilsen in 1842. Of course, there were variations. Depending on the quality of water, the hops produced a different intensity of bitterness. In Bavaria, where the water is usually a little harder than in Bohemia, brewers used fewer hops and focused on the malt character of their beers. A Bavarian Helles is a tricky beer to brew. The style is unforgiving, as many home brewers and even brewpub owners had to learn the hard way when the finished beer showed aromas of rancid butter or cooked vegetables. Some people believe that Bavarian Helles is a boring beer style. In fact, it's not. It's a very complex beer style, but it's low in hop bitterness. So there's nothing to be hidden. No flaws should be shown in a Bavarian Helles. It has to have a clean, malty aroma. And that beer became the signature beer from Munich in the early 20th century. It has been brewed before on the countryside, but only in the beginning of the 20th century, brewers in Munich began to brew that beer style, and soon enough that also became the one beer style that's known at the Oktoberfest. A bit stronger version, but basically it's a malt-driven beer and has lots of malty aromas. The Munich Oktoberfest is truly one of a kind.
was first organized in 1810 to celebrate the wedding of Crown Prince Ludwig of Bavaria and Princess Therese. The venue was an ample open space that is now known as Theresienwiese or simply Wiesen. It was so successful that locals wanted to celebrate it every year, and so they did, except in times of war. Soon enough, the Oktoberfest became an international tourist attraction. Nowadays, the 2 weeks of Oktoberfest attract an average of 6 million visitors who drink 60,000 hectoliters of beer. They serve the beer there traditionally in large 1-liter mugs, the so-called Maß. But be careful when you enjoy the Wiesen beer, because at around 6% alcohol by volume, the beer is substantially stronger than a standard lager. Industrial-scale brewing, like all other industrial development of the 19th century, had its downside. Many skilled brewers who could not keep up with the changes in the industry in Central Europe went out of business. They had to look for new markets. So the most adventurous of them emigrated to America to start a new career in brewing. Many US breweries were founded by German brewers like Eberhard Anheuser, Adolphus Busch, Frederick Miller, or Johann Gottlieb Pabst. Some of the most successful breweries carried German brand names like Rheingold. As late as in the 1960s, the working language of many US breweries was German. And those German immigrants brought the latest technology with them, which included yeast samples from the newly founded Pilsner and Lager beer breweries in Europe.
During the 19th century, many brewing towns developed their own beer styles. Most of them are malt-driven, like Pilsner or Munich or Vienna beer. Well, here in San Francisco, the beer style is driven by the yeast. San Francisco has a unique climate. All year round, the average temperature is 61 degrees Fahrenheit, which equates at 16 degrees Celsius. Well, when brewers came from Europe, they brought with them the yeast that they're used to. In the 19th century, that was bottle fermenting yeast, Saccharomyces pastorianus. But that yeast demands lower temperatures, which you cannot get here. There's no natural ice here. So when they exposed their wort to that particular European yeast strain, they got a very different result. A beer that we have in this brown bag here, it's how they call it, steam beer, because steam was the primarily new technology of the 19th century. But that style again died out during the 20th century. And in the late 1960s, there was only one brewery left that brewed steam beer. Fritz Maytag rescued it and made San Francisco a brewing town again with that Anchor steam beer. Well, now there's many brewers that brew the style again, so now they call it California Common. The yeast produces some esters when it's exposed to higher temperatures. It's a very creamy beer, and it's the beer of this town. And I cannot sample it here because we're not allowed to drink beer on the beach, but we shall sample it later.
San Francisco has a lot of tourist attractions, and it has a lively bar scene. And lots of people enjoy a cold drink with friends after work. But America also has some of the strictest laws regarding alcoholic beverages. There are lots of rules that try to limit alcohol consumption, including the legal drinking age of 21 years. Some of these are relics of prohibition. When this ban was lifted with the 21st Amendment, lawmakers were afraid that people would drink too much, or that they would look for the strongest beers they could get. So, until about 20 years ago, brewers were not allowed to put the alcoholic strength of their beer onto the label. But beer drinkers then cleverly asked the bar staff at the superior beer bars and got the right recommendations. That was not necessary, and also not my intention, when I visited a bar after a long stroll through town, a San Francisco classic, not too far away from Haight-Ashbury. Just my kind of place, with one of the broadest selections of domestic and international beers you can find in America. I sipped reverently on my glass, enjoyed good conversations, and fed the music box with a few coins. What a fabulous way to end your day, isn't it? One thing I like about America is that brewmasters are treated like rock stars, especially if they come from Germany. American beer drinkers generally have respect for German beer culture because it's so diverse. There are small Franconian towns that focus on Keller beer, a local variety of lager. And just a few miles away, you find cities that brew only Weizen or wheat beer. The Franconian Keller beer has its name from the beer cellars that are used to mature the beer. In the old days, before the invention of artificial cooling, brewers would build large vaults and cool them with natural ice. And on top of these cellars, they would plant trees, preferably chestnut, because the leaves would provide shadow and a cold environment for the cellar. On the other hand, the shadow was attracting consumers as well, and this is how the beer garden was invented.
Franconia is one of the regions with the highest density of breweries worldwide. Sometimes they're even neighbors. While the beers they brew are similar, but each of them is unique. They tend to be very low in carbonation, relatively high in bitterness, and they also have a nice soft touch to them. It's lager beers we can drink a lot of. And these beers tend to be popular here in the beer gardens of the region. Wheat beer was popular in many parts of Europe, but especially so here in Bavaria. In fact, it was so popular that in 1516 it was forbidden to use wheat in brewing beer. The so-called Purity Law of 1516 meant that it was only allowed to brew beer with barley. But it had a backdoor. The Bavarian Duke more or less had a privilege to brew wheat beer on his own account, in his own brew houses, the so-called Weiße Brauhäuser. And he had this right up till the early 19th century. Then these Weiße Brauhäuser were sold. And here's one that still operates today.
The Schneider family acquired the brewery in Kelheim in 1928. and they brought with them the original Weissbier recipe and the original Weissbier yeast from their brewery in Munich. The Weissbier yeast is a top fermenting strain, which means that the yeast rises to the top of the fermenting vessel at the end of fermentation. In the fermenting cellar, you can smell the clove-like aromas that are so typical for this beer. Thank God I was not only allowed to smell, but also to sample it with the owner of this legendary brewery. Bavarian Hefeweizen may be the most well-known wheat beer in the world, but other German beer styles have lots of wheat on the grain bill as well. One of these styles is the Gose, a beer that was first introduced in the medieval town of Goslar. Unlike its Bavarian counterpart, it is spiced with coriander and salt. Now you think, what? Salt in my precious beer? Yes, there are some beers that contain a little salt. Another well-known example of a salted beer is oyster stout. As everybody knows, you cannot quench your thirst with seawater. The salt will dry out your body. Well, it's the same with the brewing recipes here. Although it is the desired effect in beer, and the amount of salt in the Gose is substantially lower than in seawater. But basically, the salt enhances the dry perception of the beer. It makes it taste crisper. And salt makes you want to drink more. Perfect marketing, invented in the Middle Ages.
Through the small German town of Goslar runs a small river called Gose. It's only about 7 kilometers long, but has given the name to a beer style, Gose. Well, let's go to the source. I mean, not to the source of the river, but to the source of the beer style.
The lovely city center of Goslar is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site because it has 1,800 historic buildings, which is more than any other town in Germany. About 1,000 years ago, Goslar was one of the wealthiest communities in the Holy Roman Empire. The main reason for that was that in the Middle Ages they found copper, lead and silver in the surrounding hills. And they were also mining for the salt, which was later added to the beer of the local breweries to deliver that extra dryness.
Gose is one of the most historic beer styles in Germany. Legend has it that Otto III, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was drinking Gose back in 1000. Well, anyway, there's records that prove that Gose was brewed in 1332. Afterwards, the style migrated to the east, to larger cities, to university towns like Leipzig or Halle. In the 18th and 19th century, Gose was the drink of choice for students in Halle and Leipzig. They were drinking from these bottles, and well, it was in these bottles where the Gose fermented. It was bottle conditioned, and yeast and lactic bacteria would form sort of a bottle stopper in these bottles. The style almost died out, but then after Germany's reunification, many breweries started to brew Gose again. It came back to its original town, Goslar. So there is a brewery in Goslar that brews the original Gose, well, maybe with a little twist. A very refreshing beer anyway.
Gose is a truly exceptional beer, because under the German purity law, you're not allowed to use any other ingredients than water, malted grains, hops, and yeast in the brewing process. But the Germans are somewhat pragmatic and consider Gose a beer style that has been around 500 years longer than the purity law. Therefore, it's legal to brew it. Still, you're not allowed to add other ingredients like cucumber, that is part of the original recipe, like in other countries. Respecting that, you're also not allowed to use those herbs and spices that were added to beer long before the Reinheitsgebot was written down in 1516. But these herbs and spices were commonly accepted in northern Germany for many, many centuries. And they are still essential ingredients used in another classic, the Belgian Groot beer. Ghent is another well-preserved medieval town with a rich heritage. Situated at the confluence of the Schelde and Leie rivers, it played a significant role in Flanders' economic development. Today, it is Belgium's second largest city and claims to have the largest pedestrian area in the country. According to the tourism office, Ghent has 620 cafes that are in fact beer bars, and they say that these cafes serve around 250 different beers. Alone while walking the streets there, I found one particular cafe that claims to even have a selection of 500 beers. Naturally, I had to see for myself. And while enjoying a nice triple, I came across a common Flanders habit. To prevent you from stealing one of the more expensive beer glasses, you have to leave one of your shoes as a pawn with the waiter.
In the Middle Ages, not all beers were brewed with hops. In fact, most of them were not. Some British ales didn't contain any hops. And here in Europe, in many places on the continent, you did have your special Groot beer. Groot meant a mixture of several herbs. They were different from town to town. They had different recipes how to produce the Groot beer. It has always some bitter ingredients, always some sweet ingredients, always some spicy ingredients. The recipes were typically a secret, and they were kept secret by the town that had a duty on them. So if you wanted to brew beer, you had to buy the Groot from the city Groot house. And if you had the Groot, you could brew your beers according to the recipe. Beers were different from one town to the other. Here in Ghent, they have re-established a Groot beer brewery. Let's see how the beer tastes. Here at the Groot Brewery, they have a variety of beers, and they range from very light to very strong, also from very light in color to rather dark in color. So this means you have a variety that is meant by different malts and by varieties in the Groot, in the mixture of the herbs that are used. The first beer is a wheat beer, which is very similar to other wheat beers in Belgium, but that beer is, well, without hops. On the other hand, you get the very strong ones that have also a little hop in it, but also a lot of alcohol. So that would be the wheat, well light in color, a blonde, a bit darker, and it's very aromatic. And even more aroma, the darker it gets. Here you get this malty taste and some spiciness. And at the end of the line, this is going to be the most potent one. Very rich in flavor, and there's some spicy bitterness in the finish. So all of them are a range that you would like to try if you ever come to Ghent. Well,
That's it again for this episode, my fellow beer enthusiasts. Ready for our next travels? Then pack your bags and follow me to fabulous beer-related cities like Düsseldorf, Seattle, London, Gdansk, Portland, Crescent City, and back to Shanghai, where our journey began. Too bad there wasn't time to go to Scandinavia, because the ancient Vikings there believed that the giant goat, whose udders provided an endless supply of beer, waited for them in Valhalla, the Viking heaven. We should definitely have that on our next travel route. Until then, cheers, Prost, Salut, and goodbye.